Without further ado, let me just now start then formally our last session of the Europeana Research and Impact Symposium. We've been already through 3 very successful, very exciting and insightful sessions, both by way of the presentations of speakers, but also of the many and important and consequential questions that participants have been posing and then discussants have been discussing. In this session, we hope we're going to be continuing that process and moving to the last part. We're really sort of moving to this broader area, the area in which we view and we want to view this notion of impact and the notion of research, how we can sort of bridge and marry research on the one side and the use of digital cultural heritage resources for research on the one hand, with social impact, cultural impact, ethical impacts, political impact. So we want to bridge this and broaden it really to this broader agenda in which communities, we say audiences, but audiences are also participants. They're not just passive audiences in our contemporary world. And secondly, processes of participation and processes of consequence for the political, the social, the ethical dimensions of society. We want to see how these really tally with cultural heritage. And our landscape is a landscape in which we know that our communications today are shaped very much by platforms, by global digital networked infrastructures. A lot of activity around notions of identity, around notions of collective memory happens now there, right? And these bring with them challenges, problems, and conundrums. They also bring opportunities, but also these problems and conundrums. And I hope that with the help of our participants in the panel today, we're going to be able to tackle that. So we're happy, really, very much to welcome today a really powerful team of participants, panelists, Geert Lovink, Anat Ben David, Jenny Kidd, and Maria Paula Arias. I will introduce them one by one as they start sharing with us their perspectives. We're going to have, first of all, an initial introduction of points of view by our speakers with a presentation, and then we're going to go into discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first panelist, Geert Lovink. Geert is a theorist, a media theorist, a researcher working in Amsterdam, a researcher in the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. He's been the author of many important books and influential books, may I say, critical books on especially networked cultures and social networks, starting from Uncanny Networks, his first book in 2002, Dark Fiber, again in 2002, and a number of other books, Zero Comments, dealing with blogs and the conundrums that have to do with blogging, Networks Without a Cause, and his latest book is Sad by Design, in which he assesses the new regimes of individuality and sociality that are shaped very much in the realm of contemporary social media networks. So now Geert has been invited to talk to us about his notion of Stacktivism that he's been working on with his team in the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, the Institute of Network Cultures that he leads there, an organized networks approach. So Geert, you have the floor.
Thanks so much for the invitation and the possibility to present some of my recent findings. Yeah, we're with a very small team here in Amsterdam at the Institute of Network Cultures. We're in fact only with less than 3 people, so it's not it's not a very big place. But yeah, we have a lot of contributors. People who are in many parts of the world, and so what we're doing is we're trying to bring together a lot of people. Now in the COVID period, that's of course not possible, and we do that in a virtual way. But yeah, we have been taken away, this very, very important tool we always had, to come together in the real space. And even though I understand, that the Zoom and Teams and other tools give us new possibilities to bring in new people, I strongly believe that the future will be, let's say, hybrid, in the sense that we will bring together people who can meet in the real space with remote participation and involvement of others. And in fact, in the last 25 years, we've already done a lot of experiments in this direction, which sadly, in the COVID period has come to a radical halt, right? We were forced into the virtual without being able to, in fact, continue our hybrid practices. So I really hope very soon, within weeks, months, or a year, that we can, and the Europeana too, that we can pick up again that thread, and bringing in, of course, the good things from having this tremendous opportunity we had in the last year to bring together so many people on a virtual level, and experience a little bit at that level too. It's now really time to go to the hybrid again. Okay, I want to speak here about some of the recent strategies. Before that, I want to say my work has always been about media, alternative media, tactical media in the 90s, counter strategies. Then, of course, in the 90s also, my emphasis with many others were on creating networks. NetTime mailing list is one of the most powerful still existing ones, but okay, there are many networks we have created also as the Institute of Network Cultures around issues that are directly related to the work of Europeana, like the critical point of view, which was about Wikipedia, but also Society of the Query, which was about the politics of search engines, and lately, of course, more related to digital publishing and to Money Lab, the question of how artists and designers, creative, are going to make a living in the 21st century. And that's, of course, goes from crowdfunding to Bitcoin to blockchain and now crypto arts, etc. Right? So these are the topics that we are dealing with. And lately, of course, in the last, let's say, 10 years of this, ongoing saga, because my involvement is now, over 30 years. So the last decade really has been defined by the platform, and not just the platformization, but the realization that many of us feel, namely that we are stuck on the platform, right? And so the platform is not just an opportunity or a possibility. It is now really a very much for millions, if not billions, of people around the globe, a psychological condition. Now, in my last book, I deal with that in Sad by Design. I'm not going to here bother you with the sad state of the psychic, mind and the mental state of many millions, especially young people. Here, I want to talk about strategies, right? And strategies really to liberate ourselves from the platform condition. Now, how do we do that? There are a lot of, let's say, strategies there that people have been trying, and we ourselves, as the Institute of Network Cultures, already since 2011, starting off with, in fact, with our Greek friends, We started the Unlike Us network in 2011, which was about not just about the social media critique, because we saw, that this is legitimized and that we can, gather these critiques, but also to work on social media alternatives. Now, what we can say is that, especially also, from the digital heritage perspective, that we can say that in the past 10 years, not much has happened, right? More and more we got stuck on the platforms, but we didn't really have a viable social media alternatives that we could offer, right? So, and this kind of created this feeling that we were more encapsulated, that we were stuck in this vortex down in this abyss, right? So that there's not a really way out. Everybody knows these debates we all have with friends, colleagues, the audience about, I want to leave Facebook, but I can't. I cannot betray my colleagues or my friends, my family, and so on, right? And this has been going on for a long time. Maybe only very, very recently, especially after the siege of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., we have seen that really hundreds and hundreds of millions of people started to leave. In first instance, they started to leave WhatsApp, right? Maybe not so much Instagram or Facebook itself, but we have seen that over the last couple of years, really apps like Signal in particular, and Telegram, and a few others, have really established themselves as these viable alternatives that we were working on for and we were longing for so long, right? So there is some positive news, especially only very recently, in fact. In fact, only over the past couple of months can we see that this shift, this exodus, if you want to call it like that, is happening. Now, the strategy here has always been that if you want to critique the platform, you don't have to, let's say, design alternative platforms, because it is the platform logic itself that is the problem, right? We're not longing for alternatives there. What we should do, and maybe there, okay, we can discuss, is this a renaissance? Is this a nostalgia? But we strongly feel that for a lot of the institutions as well, the solution will be to go back to the tools. We need other tools, and not media or networks or platforms themselves, but small communication tools that are really, really tied to the specific needs of groups, communities, right, that want to achieve something. So where the goal-driven aspect of it becomes very important. Now, we have a lot of tools, and we developed so many tools, but they never really reached a wider audience. So there's a real challenge there. Now, one of the two principles in that direction I want to take out here. And I want to start first with the idea I developed with Ned Rossiter about already a decade ago, which is the design principle of the organized network. Now, in the organized network is not really the network of the 90s or something like that. The organized network really, really tries to formulate a response to the exploitation of the weak links that all these big platforms have done, the Googles, Facebooks, and so on, right? And instead of the weak links, the weak links, we all know, that's the friend of my friends. That's my whole kind of address book that gets, exploited and turned inside out. Instead, these tools should really focus on smaller groups, what we call strong links, So not the weak ties, but the strong ties, so that we can really focus on the things we want to achieve. Okay. Now the question there is, of course, are these organized networks really focused on an idea? Again, this might be a romantic idea, maybe some kind of Catholic European idea of community, right? Communitas. Is this really, what we want, or what is realistic at the moment? Because we are in a situation in which the society is very, very divided, and so how do we deal with difference, debate in dealing with this question of community? Because the community still has this idea that we are together, that we know why we're there, that we share certain values. And this precisely is the problem, right? So that there's not enough values, let's say, that we share. For instance, if we look at the awful way, for instance, WhatsApp groups work, in neighborhood watch, this is not what we want, and this is not how we would define, community, right? A community is not a WhatsApp and neighborhood group. I don't know if you ever participated in one, but this is the kind of policing really that we did not have in mind. So we need other design principles there. That's kind of from the bottom up. And of course, always a lot of the initiatives have come from the bottom up, right? The idea of Schumacher, small is beautiful, where you work on federalized, decentralized approaches, right? From the bottom up. Okay. So that is, of course, also an original 90s idea of the networks, to create networks of networks of networks. All right, that is one approach. The other approach that we've also seen coming up, let's say in the last maybe 5 or 10 years, is much more a top-down approach, which I had initially found difficult to deal with, but we can also say that it's really, really necessary for us to tackle the big questions. And not just only believe in small solutions, but at least, and a lot of people find this idea appealing. Why? Because they see that the urgencies of the world's problems are big problems, and they cannot necessarily be solved, in a small group. Even though we can start there, we need to at least, work on the big level as too. And I've formulated that strategy in an activist form as the Stacktivism approach, namely the stack, meaning that we understand, that there are in all the work that we do, there are many, many layers, right? Now, and there is, of course, this book, which is the Stack book by Benjamin Bratton. And then when you look here inside the book, you can see that the stack, the layers are all, listed, from the user to the interface, to the address, the city, to cloud, and then going to the Earth, right? And the Earth, of course, is then the kind of the planetary perspective, and that a lot of us, are thinking about that in the COVID period of global interconnectivity, but also all the issues of climate change. Up to the level, of course, of a much more drastic or dramatic point in which we see global decline, not just decline, but collapse. We see extinction. We see forms of planetary developments that are much, much more drastic. And this is also why we need to, let's say, at least think in, even though I'm not Hegelian, we are invited by the circumstances to think much more in a radical form of totality, right? And at least take that into account, and at least, and this can be an approach also, to tackle the platform, because of course the platform itself, is an instantiation, is a manifestation of what Breton then calls planetary computation, or what Hugh Hui calls cosmotechnics. There are many terms for this level, and we need to think at that level at the same time. So I propose here a dual strategy to go top down and bottom up at the same time, to create decentralized tools and networks, while radically rethinking also the level of the technological totality that we're faced with.
Thank you so much, Geert. I mean, that's really inspiring ideas there, and I hope that as we move forward in the discussion, we're going to find ways in order to see how we can use some of these strategies in the area also of heritage and heritage building, effectively, how we sort of shape our heritage and define our past through the use of digital networks as they are today, perhaps redefining the current situation. So without further ado, I will move on now to our second panelist, Anat Ben David. Anat is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, Political Science and Communication, and the co-founder of the Open Media and Information Lab in the Open University of Israel. She's been researching for many years now on the history of geopolitics of the web, on data governance and data sovereignty. She's inspired by digital science and technology studies, social political studies, social media, and also she's been sort of working on digital and computational methods for web research. And she's going to be talking to us on archiving social media as boundary work. And I think that we all know the situation in Israel now. So Anat has prepared a pre-recorded presentation. I don't know, Anat, if you prefer to play that, prefer to play that, or talk yourself. I mean, it's either way, it's fine for us. I mean, we want to just listen to your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be with you today. I'll apologize in advance if there will be some geopolitical interventions that are beyond my control. I will have to leave the panel, but I hope at least to talk these 10 minutes without external interruptions. So apologies in advance about that. So I'd like to talk about the problem of social media archiving and frame it as a process of boundary work. And I'll be reading my presentation in order to keep with the time. On 6 January 2021, Twitter decided to permanently suspend the accounts of former US President Donald Trump after his involvement in inciting crowds of supporters that violently invaded US Congress in an attempt to overturn his defeat in the 2020 presidential elections. While the implications of the president move by Twitter and others are the topic of other important discussions, today I'd like to use the example of the suspended Twitter account of Donald Trump as a prism for understanding the politics of social media archiving as boundary work, a struggle of demarcation on the right to preserve and to access digital public records produced online. Originally conceptualized by Thomas Geering, boundary work referred to the philosophical problem of demarcation, or what delineates between science and non-science. Previous research on boundary work in the sciences has demonstrated that the delineation of new emerging fields or knowledge and practice is often the construct of social negotiation of various actors and interests. In the case of social media archiving, the delineation is multiple. It asks what delineates between archive and non-archive, but also between institutions and professions such as platforms and heritage institutions, researchers, journalists, citizens, or users. So I'd like to demonstrate such negotiations on the delineation of social media archive using the example of Trump. His ban from Twitter entails that the entire history of the former president's tweets is no longer available on the platform. Twitter also denied the National Archives, the heritage institution responsible for the preservation of presidential administration's libraries, to create an archived legacy account of the former president's tweets, as is the case with other accounts of the 45th president's administration. The wording used by Twitter and the National Archives are interesting in this case. Twitter considered the archived accounts as a resurrection or revival of dead accounts. The National Archives, on their part, view the legacy accounts as simply archives that are placed in their native environment. The National Archives announced that while they acknowledge the platform's authority to decline hosting the legacy account, they have independent copies and are working to make the content available as a download in the near future on their website. So the same content considered as forbidden resurrection when appearing on one platform is legitimized as a download on the other. These technical definitions do not disclose the reshaping of power relations between traditional memory institutions and internet giants over the ownership and the right to archive and lend access to public records. Meanwhile, Trump's Twitter archive is very much alive on the web, thanks to the work and initiatives of several institutions, journalists, researchers, and individual users. The Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, which continuously archives social media accounts of public figures, regardless of platforms' policies, has 51,800 archived snapshots of Trump's Twitter account. They are accessible on the web already now. Thus, while not removing the entire history of Trump's tweets, the Internet Archive has delineated on its own terms its relationship vis-a-vis the platform's policies and what ought or can be publicly available. The collection section of the Internet Archive also provides a torrent of the complete Trump Twitter archive, which was uploaded by one of its users. The item is tagged as community data, available for immediate download. Elsewhere on the web, a programmer named Brendan has built a script that scrapes Trump's tweets in real time and made them available in searchable form on a website called thetrumpaRchive.com. In the frequently asked questions section of the website, he explains, "I made this site in 2016 and didn't really think Trump would win the election or continue tweeting like this as the president of the United States, but here we are." Furthermore, he notes that the aim is to provide a public resource, and Twitter doesn't really offer these features. Trump's Twitter usage is historic, as strange as that may be, end quote. From a user's perspective, then, the evaluation of the publicness and historical value of these records is not solely the realm of archivists, but of lay people. And if the platform's affordances do not allow certain features, then these can be offered to the public independently. Brandon's approach brings us closer to researchers' approach to data collection and social media. Documenting the Now, a research-based initiative for ethical data collection and archiving of Twitter, intended especially for allowing bottom-up and activist curation and data collection, also lists several collections of Trump Twitter data that have hitherto been collected by researchers and activists. The final example of a living Trump Twitter archive is PoliTwoop, a project run by ProPublica, the investigative journalism organization. PoliTwoop lends access to tweets that Donald Trump deleted throughout his career and up until the account's suspension. So how can Trump's archive both be permanently suspended and yet so very much alive? This may be the outcome of the ongoing boundary work on delineating between what the social media archive is and what it is not, or what it ought to be. All actors involved have different justifications for why it is important to archive social media, let alone of public figures, and why it is in the public interest that they should be the ones doing it. All actors also acknowledge that social media companies own the data and they have the right to decide about the suspension of the account. There is lesser agreement, however, as to the methods, legal constraints, the legitimacy to both collect and lend access to archived social media content, both in real time as well as in retrospect. The boundary work, which currently takes place around social media archiving, involves technical and ontological questions. For example, can one consider data or metadata obtained from the platform's API or through a third-party vendor as an archive? But also ideological and political questions about the right to access to public records. Each of the actors I mentioned earlier is advancing a different agenda and claims of ownership to the type of knowledge work that they are entitled to perform. Heritage institutions, used to being the authoritative entities who are endowed with the duty and the privilege to preserve digital cultural heritage, have tremendous, I'm using a Trump word, challenges performing the duty when it comes to social media archiving. Legal and technological barriers constantly remind them that their agency has been severely limited. As they are bound to comply to platforms' legal terms, the solutions that thus far have been developed by national libraries and other web archives are partial at best. Researchers who are also used to access social media data due to their value for conducting social research face endless restrictions and limits on the types of data that platforms allow them to use. And even when they gain access, researchers oftentimes cannot share their data sets or make them publicly available. Another boundary work is taking place between researchers, archivists, and activists. Activists and journalists, for example, are less constrained by legal barriers as heritage institutions are, but they are not concerned with issues of long-term preservation, annotation, or description. The emergence of a new field and of a new project is a moment of crisis, but also opportunity. From the broad perspective of the public interest, this is perhaps the moment to acknowledge the legitimacy, limits, and needs of all actors involved in building social media archives. Through such acknowledgement, we can start a discussion on new, perhaps creative and interventional ways for redefining what the social media archive is and what it ought to be in the present and for the future. Indeed, platforms already possess too much power for deciding on these important questions by themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for opening up this other dimension now, Anat, that really leads us very much on questions of archiving, questions of long memory. Questions are very central for cultural heritage, indeed, really, because you took the example of Donald Trump. We have to think about the importance of all these debates about identity, collective identity. Some of them are very toxic in Europe as well, that are taking place on social media. It's part of our cultural record, and there's a double, prerogative here, of course, of both analyzing this and understanding, but also intervening as well, which I think both you and Geert have been sort of keen to highlight. So without further ado, I will move now to our third panelist, Jenny Kidd. Jenny is a reader in the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University. She is really an old-timer and one of the sort of doyens of research in the field of participatory digital heritage for museums. She's been sort of working on social media in museums. She's authored Museums and the New Mediascape, which is an important foundational book in the field. And she's now, we're just awaiting her new book actually to come out, Critical Encounters with Immersive Storytelling. So this is going to be coming up this summer. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. She's the managing director of the Museums and Society Journal, and also a series editor with Bloomsbury of their studies in digital cultures. And Jenny, I think your talk is going to be about the use of social media, more particularly digital engagement, exploring digital engagement via Twitter in the early days of the pandemic. So, Jenny, you have the floor.
Better turn the mic on. Thank you very much. I'm now an old timer. That's good to know. Yeah, thanks Costis, and to Nicole and Alba and everybody else for all their work pulling this event together. I'm hoping you can see these slides. I've only got a couple here that I'm going to speak to. So I've decided here that what I want to do is to talk about our process on a project which we've currently got underway. And I'm hoping that in doing so, what I'll do is connect with some of those other themes that have been discussed already, both in this session and in some of the other sessions as well. So as part of this project, which you can see on the screen here now, my colleague Eva Nieto-McAvoy and I have been exploring, like many other researchers have been, cultural institutions' digital activities during the pandemic and, of course, their impacts. Specifically, what we've been trying to do is look at what they've been up to in the social media space. So ours is a multi-method exploration, which started with an analysis of that activity, which I'm going to talk briefly about, and which is now being complemented by a series of interviews with digital and social media managers in the United Kingdom. So I don't suppose I need to remind anybody here quite how frantic the shift to online was for museums, galleries and heritage sites at the start of the pandemic. There have been lots of reports which have offered an appraisal of how comprehensive that pivot, as it has been termed, was, but fewer which have been able to unpack the kinds of engagement and interaction that ensued. So that's something that we've been trying to do as a part of this project. And so I'm going to talk briefly about what we've done, and then I'm going to spill all of my anxieties about the way in which we've done it. And I'm hoping that in doing so, that transparency might somehow be helpful, and it maybe will be cathartic for myself. So as an aside, I really liked what Maria was saying in the session this morning about heritage practitioners as storytellers. And researchers are also storytellers who can open up their approaches for dialogue, as she was suggesting. So here goes, that's what I'm going to try and do. So the questions that have underpinned the study that we've been doing are these. What kinds of arts and cultural content were being circulated in social media these early weeks of the pandemic, and who by? What kinds of content gained the most traction, and can we begin to understand why? Perhaps through a thematic analysis of that content or through understanding its tone. We're looking at what kinds of interactions ensued, and we're interested to see whether that represents in any way a kind of shift from previous findings about the nature of digital cultural heritage engagement in social networking contexts, whether institutions are merely kind of in broadcast mode or whether they're trying to do something which is perhaps a bit more dynamic and dialogic. And then lastly, and I think this for me is the most interesting of the questions that we're exploring, this question about whether and how the tweets intersect with broader debates that were happening at the time, and if so, what conclusions we might be able to draw from that. So how then have we set about doing this? So here's a bit of kind of insight into the method that we've been using. Well, we've been using Twitter data as the basis for that analysis, and that immediately, of course, sets up a whole bunch of limitations to the study that we need to be transparent about, and I'm going to come back to my agonizing about all of those limitations in a moment. We've got a kind of United Kingdom UK framework for all of this, which was kind of dictated by the shape of the larger project that this work was a part of. That doesn't mean it's not an international sample that we're working with, but it has, for example, dictated the dates that we were using as a way into our data set. So we've used the first day of the UK lockdowns as the kind of start point for our collection. And of course, that has shaped the kind of data that we've collected there. So we've got this 6 weeks of data across 2 hashtags, which you can see there, culture in quarantine and museum at home. And these hashtags were chosen because they speak to and across the efforts of cultural institutions quite broadly defined to engage via Twitter during that period. Hashtags, of course, are not unproblematic as a way into finding a data set. They miss a huge amount and we're aware of that, but we've had to have some parameters here in order to make the work manageable. So that then has given us 9,061 tweets, that we have run a kind of quantitative analysis on using, the kind of basic Twitter metadata that's available. But then to balance that, what we've done is we've used a kind of small data approach. So we've taken a subset of that data and we've done a qualitative thematic analysis on that using NVivo. And the idea with that smaller sample is that it works as a kind of a thickening strategy for the analysis, because of course, just having lots and lots of data is not in itself any indication of, quality or insightfulness in that data. So in doing that, what we've been doing is coding for tone, themes, connections, and values in the tweets there. And we've looked at every tweet in that sample and the discussions that have been happening around those tweets as well. And so for us, it's in that kind of qualitative analysis that things start to get interesting. So you can begin to see, and we're still doing our analysis, we'll be writing a report at some point, but you begin to see what kinds of content did really kind of galvanize and energize people at that time. So content linked to the arts and creativity as a way of coping, to education, and content that was expressly emotive or humorous, for example. And it tells us a story about the kinds of content and interactions that users then were finding valuable, and begins to suggest how we might be able to understand and articulate that value during this particular time of crisis. So the analysis also tells us a little bit about how the data interconnects with other debates at the time. So, quite vociferous debates that were happening about funding and support for the arts in a host of contexts, and perceptions about the COVID effort more broadly, in what Michelle Zapavinia calls the searchable talk created through the hashtags, and how those are co-located with other hashtags. And so those function really interestingly in our sample as what she calls kind of inward and outward facing meta discourse. And that's something that we want to explore further in the data set. So, okay, so far so good. However, as I've indicated, I do have these kind of lingering concerns about what we've been doing. And so in the spirit of transparency, then, here are my reflections and the questions that are keeping me up at night. So there are some big old questions here, and they pick up on some of the themes we've already been hearing about here, and of course in other sessions as well. And, that big old question about who or what is rendered invisible by our approach. In what ways does this snapshot that we've taken limit the scope of what we're able to then see? Twitter is so limiting in kind of demographic terms. We know that users are young-ish, predominantly male, English speaking, skewed by occupation and socioeconomic groupings. So who is included and excluded by circumstance or by choice is something we need to think very carefully about. And as I said, our hashtags also are very limiting as well. And so following from that then, how can we talk meaningfully about those absences? We went into this research hoping to be able to say something meaningful about digital inequalities, perhaps, or about digital ambivalence. But can we really, given the data set that we've managed to amass? We need to be really kind of, honest and transparent about all of that. We don't want to overinterpret from the data that we have, but neither do we want these really important themes to be rendered invisible or to kind of fall out of the discussion about this data. There's another, and this is a kind of quite technical point, but it's one that's really been causing me some anguish. This issue of intercoder reliability in the work that we've been doing. So, where we've been working with the data and coding it, how in practice we've been doing that. And intercoder reliability has been something that we've struggled with in this study. Given the qualitative investigation, coding for tone was fine, same for themes, but coding for values, and as they were being kind of recognized or being debated in the data set, was more problematic, which is really interesting given what we were just hearing about there being not enough values that we share. And so that kind of really resonated for me. So that proved to be really quite hard because of course that's a really interpretive endeavor. And having made a stance early on in the project that intercoder reliability was going to be really important for this project, and it was going to speak to the reliability of the data set and the approach, I soon kind of wanted to throw the whole idea in the bin, I have to say. Another of the big old questions here, which again relates to some of what we've been hearing, that question about who is benefiting from our approach. Well, hopefully heritage organizations and policymakers, with any luck in time, visitors and users. Those will be some of the impacts we might want to shout about. If we were going to be writing a ref impact case study, perhaps, I've written one of them before, and this is the kind of stuff that we like to hear about. But also, of course, Twitter benefiting, there in the research that we're doing. So we're documenting, we're unpacking, we're signposting activity on a site that we might think has a kind of problematic underpinning logic or business model or architecture. And that's obviously something we need to think about, how activity on and through these platforms intersects with traditional forms of museological and institutional power to amplify, manage, or silence is something for us to think more about, no doubt. And not only that, we obtained our data set from a commercial data service, in our case Vicinitas, but it could have been any one of a number of those services. That's kind of becoming a standard practice, given how social media companies have been causing mischief for researchers by changing their APIs. And institutions, of course, use analytics services all of the time. And this means that these companies too are now entangled in our processes, and they are clearly not neutral. And then lastly, a kind of quite difficult to articulate concern, and I'm possibly overstating this, but it's one that does concern me. And this is whether our analysis could be used to kind of sediment somehow the meaning and impacts of all of this activity in the longer term, and with what consequences. Might it become a kind of a flattening statement about what it all meant? And do we feel comfortable with that if that's what happens, especially in light of all of those limitations that I've noted? And that's, I guess, kind of the flip side of the impact coin. So we have all of these anxieties and we haven't resolved them, and I don't suppose we will. But I do like to think that there is a value in that kind of reflection and that kind of transparency. That said, there is such privilege in having the tools, the platform, and the time to reflect on all of that at all. And my hope is that through discussions like this, we can make a case for the value of that kind of transparency and that kind of reflection, that we can make it a part of the work that we do towards digital literacy and research and evaluation practices that are just and ideally do no harm. And that seems to me to kind of match the ambitions of cultural institutions as they commit ever more fully to participatory practices and exploring more expansively their civic and societal function. And that's pretty much all I wanted to say. And I know I'm very much out of time, but because I'm a bit cheeky, I'm just going to pop that slide up in the background, which gives you that sense of how we're picking up on some of this in the next stage of the research. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. And when I said you're an old-timer, I mean an old-timer in a very new field, actually, because I'm in the field that I'm shaping the last 10 years practically. So, yeah. But anyway, I mean, I want to say that we're really very, very happy to, for your presentation. You are involved pretty centrally in the Europeana Impact Initiative as well. So I hope that in the discussions that will follow, we'll be able to raise some of the issues that really are to do with both how we research this activity on social media today, but also how we make it useful for impact in the field of heritage as well, which I know that's very, very central in your interests. So moving on now to our last panelist, Maria Paula Arias. And Maria Paula is also one person that's very, very much involved with Europeana as well, and digital heritage, the field of digital heritage. She works, of course, more closely in the area of branding, especially as museum branding and cultural heritage institution branding relates now to this environment of social networks. And she's going to be talking to us about exploring a Twitter conversation beyond its hashtag. So Maria Paula, you have the floor.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for having me. So again, my name is Maria. My pronouns are she, her, if you want to use that moving forward. I'm a lecturer in digital media at Enterprise at MMU, but I'm also a PhD student at the University of Manchester. So this presentation is based on this doctoral research, and I'll just get started right away. So my case study is the Manchester Art Gallery, which is a cultural institution and a branch of the local government here in the Manchester City Council. And on January 2018, the gallery was planning a retrospective exhibition focused on the works by contemporary artist Sonia Boyce. The takeover included 6 performative acts, one of which was to temporarily remove the pre-Raphaelite painting Hylas and the Nymphs. And these performances were filmed and they were used to create a new artwork that aimed to explore gender trouble amongst the display in the gallery's 19th century painting gallery for this wider culture. The painting was replaced by this poster, which you can see in the screen. It explains briefly the aim of the removal and offers questions for visitors to consider how historical artworks can be reinterpreted from a contemporary perspective. And those who were invited to attend and participate during the takeover were given post-it notes and encouraged to respond then and there to these questions. The following days, regular visitors could do the same by using a provision of materials from the gallery. Online, however, the gallery announced the temporary removal and the takeover in 2 ways. So first, they published a blog post with the same text that was provided in the poster that replaced Hylas and the Nymphs. And secondly, by posting a tweet with a video showing the painting being quietly wheeled away amidst a group of participants. And in the days that followed the takeover, the gallery received a barrage of comments, both in person and through digital means. And this feedback was unexpectedly negative, and it brought the gallery a relative amount of chaos. And these responses are informally known as Nymphgate. So after the event was published in The Guardian, the gallery was inundated with tweets. So you can see here, this is a timeline of the tweets, and you can see that around the 6th day where the gallery removed the painting, that's where it was published by The Guardian. And then you can see a huge spike of tweets following this publishing this article. And these tweets, the majority of which were really negative, and they fell roughly into 3 categories. So first, they were accusing the gallery of bowing down to feminists and Puritans, often citing #MeToo, #TimesUp, really engaging with contemporary news articles that were going on around the Grid Girls and Formula One and things like that. The second theme was accusing the gallery of censorship, likening this event to those perpetrated by fascist regimes. And the third accusation, or the third main theme, was accusing the gallery of not operating properly and accusing the curators of not doing their jobs accordingly. So accusing the gallery and questioning the gallery's role in society and as an aspect of the local government. So in collecting this quantitative and qualitative data, I was able to get a rich perspective of this online conversation, relatively similar to what Jenny was mentioning earlier. This is kind of the process that I did for my thesis. What I want to talk about here is this next step that I took, which was interviewing staff members at the gallery to see how this conversation was received. And so I conducted 2 sets of interviews with people who were involved with the event, with the online reactions, and with people who were not directly involved, but were aware of what had happened. And the results point to a narrative that sees a takeover event as a disruption of the gallery's usual ways of working or ways of ordering, because this is a terminology from actor network theory, which frames the theoretical and methodological approach that I took for this. The takeover had a reverberating influence to the gallery, because staff members reacted to how the event was organized, the aims of the event, the artistic practice of Sonia Boyce, as well as the online criticism, but particularly the criticism that questioned the role of the gallery as a cultural institution. So if we look at some of these responses closer, these are some of the quotes that I had from staff members. Years before the takeover happened, the gallery had gone through a rebranding process with a vision that was, quote, more about the art in terms of spectacle, that kind of extraordinary thing that you can come and look at. And at the same time, the director that was leading the gallery at the time was, quote, never really keen on diverting resources and energy to, quote, digital. So the takeover was disruptive, not only because of this online debacle that it created, but also because the way it was organized, and the artist's practice really heavily influenced how the gallery would continue to plan its rehanging of its historic galleries. So for the takeover, Sonia Boys and the curators walked around the galleries looking at the collection on display and having a conversation about how these collections are interpreted and how they could be interpreted today and in the future. And following the takeover, once the debacle had died down, the gallery created a new working group titled Whose Power, following the renaming of the gallery where the event took place. And one of the curators describes this working group as, quote, a really positive way forward because it represents an open, democratic way to develop the gallery's program. And the current director echoes the sentiment when he compares this new direction of working to a quote unquote traditional way of working, where the curatorial department would have the sole responsibility of developing the program. And following the return of Hylas and the Nymphs, the gallery planned two collaborative events, one with Contact Theatre and another with the Manchester International Festival, as well as a temporary exhibition titled Get Together and Get Things Done. These events had in common some threads that began rooting during the takeover event. With these partnerships and the new exhibition, the gallery aimed to open the gallery to other voices other than those of the curators, where the collection on display is interpreted by visitors and where the different spaces of the gallery are used for more than just exhibitions. For example, like organizing protests, like protesting for environmental and climate change here in Manchester. So where crowdsourcing opened up spaces and reimagining these spaces was the response to the takeover event, the reaction to the online comments that the event received was so different. Because the usual ways of working did not prioritize tools or roles in quote unquote digital, there's only one person in the gallery who looks after the digital communication channels. So this meant that all the reactions that the takeover received, they were funneled to one person, which took a toll and left behind a sense of lack of purpose. So instead of questioning how to reimagine the role of online audiences, the gallery is now questioning what is the purpose of social media and whether it is right for the gallery themselves. So here are two quotes from the web manager who also manages the social media platforms, where he says that they're definitely at a moment in a place of not having a strategy, and they're quite comfortable with that because they just don't know what the relevance of social media is right now. And then he says that in terms of their social media for long-term strategy, they're in a place where they're really thinking, what is this really for? Why are we doing this? Who is it for? Fundamentally, is it for us or is it for our visitors? And I think these are extremely important questions to ask with or without a debacle. So looking back at the event and the reactions from staff members, I'd argue that there are two outcomes: a renegotiation of the relationships between people and the gallery's physical attributes, meaning the collection on display and the architecture and the people who have foot traffic inside the gallery's physical spaces. And on the other hand, you have a status quo for relationships in digital spaces and with digitally mediated audiences. I would further argue that there is a participatory barrier to the digital that has a degree of permeability, meaning it took a lot of voices online to criticize the role of the gallery in society to break through this barrier and to question its operation as a cultural institution, for staff members to react to this conversation and to find ways to respond to it. So in this sense, the gallery retains its usual way of ordering, where the physical is prioritized over the digital. Now, although it's beyond the remit of my research currently, I do question what would happen to this participatory barrier and ways of working when the gallery cannot operate in person. So I put this comic here from Business Illustrator, where it says, who led the digital transformation of your company? A, the CEO, B, the CTO, or C, COVID-19. So yes, this is outside of the remit of my research, but I do wonder since COVID, since the pandemic, whether there is a forced reordering and would this result in a renegotiation of the role of these digital technologies and audiences in the gallery, not just now as we're coming out of the pandemic, but in the future? What's going to happen with that? So that is me. That is my presentation. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Maria Paula. Yeah, so an interesting example, and one that really puts on the table, what we mean when we sort of talk about participation, and how much credence can we sort of put on the idea that museums and cultural heritage institutions are ready one way or another in order to be able to grapple with challenges that this kind of interaction in the wild puts them into, puts museums into, especially when audiences are like that. And the word is out there, what is happening really through social media, what kind of discourses, what kind of regimes of truth, regimes of value, regimes of values also emerge there. So I'd like to ask to pose the first question in our discussion now. We're going to have 10 minutes, perhaps most of this one, then move to the next one, because I want us to be able to cover a broad range of themes, which is really, taking this into account and thinking of everything that all these social media platforms are bringing, not so much only with their algorithmic logic, but also with the kinds of attitudes, the kinds of situations, kinds of articulations of sociality that are created around it. How much of a community you have there when you have this multitude of voices, etc. What is the role then? What should cultural heritage institutions do? What is really our take? What is our lessons learned from that, from all these experiences on how to move forward, how to employ strategies that really somehow reinvigorate the power and the reciprocity of the relationship between museums and their communities in different ways, in ways also that address some of the challenges and some of the problems and concerns that Geert has put in the very beginning of the session. So the floor is yours. Let's have a conversation about it. And people in the audience, guys, participants, please put your questions in the Q&A section. Our speakers, our panelists will be happy to take on your questions and respond to your points. So just pick up the microphone and speak.
Okay, I can start. So from the research that I made, one of the observations that I was able to give the Manchester Art Gallery is that they have to recognize or come to terms with more appropriate ways, come to terms with who are their online audiences and what do they want out of them. And if they truly just want to broadcast to them, then fine, but come to terms with that and be okay with that. Be okay with just using Twitter or Facebook or whatever platform it is with its own affordances and whatever it might be to broadcast to them. But if you are inviting them in this communication, dialogue, where you want their feedback, you have to have a process in place beforehand to handle those comments, whether they're really positive or really negative. So they're not, taken aback by either the type of comments that they had or the amount of comments that they had. And I would say that as all of us, we'd have to come to terms also with the platforms themselves. So know that they all have their limitations, that they all come from relatively evil corporations. So you have to come to terms with that as well. And unless there is a kind of understanding, we'll always be limited in how the platforms are used and how the audiences are considered and to what extent they can truly participate and be taken into account in the organization. Those are the observations that I had for this case study, at least.
Responses, further points?
I'm happy to chip in just to kind of agree with everything you've said there. And, if you're going to get involved in a conversation in social media spaces, you better be prepared to kind of carry it through if you want to be willing to be a part of it. you know, putting confidence in collaborative processes that, you know, maybe genuinely will inform the direction of an organization is really exciting. But just kind of showing up and putting something out there and expecting things to happen around the edges of it, you know, is not a recipe for success. And I think one of the things I'm always really struck by, and was struck by in our data set, was actually how conservative with the small c people are often being in the online environment. And Ross Parry has written quite a bit about this, that people are actually, you know, far more tentative in the online environment to, you know, really start a conversation or to do something playful and to see it through. So maybe think about being as bold in the online environment as you might be inclined to be in the offline environment now. And be forceful in your rebuttal of intolerance where it appears. Even if it loses you friends, it might gain you some as well.
So yeah, there's this question by Sally to you, actually, Jenny, that you responded to in the chat, but I think that might be worth considering here, because the question is really, at a time in which museums and cultural heritage institutions are talking so much about pluralizing and multivocality, and the way in which the local knowledge and all these perspectives that come mostly from indigenous and feminist and post-colonial discourses into the field. I mean, you know, what is happening? I mean, is there, you know, do you see that in the corpus as well? Is there something, you know, if you see it as a source of inspiration that really could come to the museum field and really bring back some of this multivocality by looting and privileging and foregrounding all those voices that are taking, you know, are you know, some expressing themselves outside the institutional realm of museum information systems and communication.
I would say in relation to our data set, and we're still doing the analysis, and I don't want to preempt where it's going to land, but that we, you know, don't see an awful lot of that, and where we do see it is probably smaller community-based organizations and institutions. Yeah, so in that sense, it's not you know, the most compelling story that we can tell, but that's also a consequence, I would have thought, of the way we've gone into doing the research and the hashtags we've used, and, you know, who has shown up to have a conversation on those. Yeah, so, but there are other people who have gone about doing research which has tried to directly address those questions of things like, you know, digital inequalities, or have sought to look at, say, the you know, response over the course of 2020 to the Black Lives Matter movement, say, which doesn't show up in our data set because it's much earlier in the pandemic. So there will be more promising stories to tell, I'm sure.
I jump in to say a rather provocative, perhaps, remark. I guess what you're all describing is Geert's vortex, in a sense, this docility of heritage institutions just having to comply with the capitalist logic of social media as the only means to reach audiences. This, in a way, is as Geert said before, is depressing to think that this is like a complete surrender to one specific kind of logic and lacking any feasible ability to come up with new and creative ways for thinking about digital heritage and digital audiences and diversity and communities without the need to be part of the platform. So I'm just saying that because I would very much like to hear what Geert has to say about this.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think we've reached a point where, you know, the work of Jürgen Habermas is again becoming completely utopian. You know, it was looked down upon for a long time to think that some kind of, you know, public can be staged, can be arranged, can be orchestrated, can also be organized in the sense of bringing together a multiplicity of opinions and arguments, right? we don't see any of that, of course. And so when I hear all this, there's a lot of rage and anger and very, very specific groups that sometimes show up. But we all know from experience in this arena that this can hardly be called a debate, in that, let's say, classic Habermasian sense, because groups don't want to come together. They don't want to come together when you want them to be there, right? So they always show up somehow on a wrong occasion. For instance, in the Dutch Twitter sphere, we know that only extreme right-wing, use hashtags. All the other people refuse to use hashtags. Now you can say, now I'm going to Twitter and I'm going to look at the hashtags, right? Okay, but then you already know, what the finding is, right? So occasionally, of course, people get angry and they get mad at each other. Now, is that a debate? Well, again, according to the Habermasian definition, of course, that's not right. So it kind of almost requires a complete, reimagination and another architecture, in my honest opinion. That if we want diversity, debate, arguments, we should really, really think of radically different social media architectures. Now, in my work, I only, mostly focus on self-organization, because I think self-organization is a very, very important kind of a priori. And even that these days is very often not happening, right? Because the field is by and large very, very chaotic, and we often do not know who we hear speaking. And then there's of course the increasing noise of algorithms and other selection methods, from filters to bots to AI, you name it, right? That only make it more difficult for, let's say, the good intentions of the cultural heritage organization to make any sense of this.
Thank you. Thanks, Geert. And I think I'll take this opportunity to move to the second topic, because we need to sort of move on a little, because it's relevant, really. Because, I mean, thinking about social action, we can think of it from individualist perspectives, we can think of collectivist perspectives, and clearly there's a lot to be said about the need for autonomy, but really very, very much of your ideas really point to. On the other hand, there are collective things that can only be dealt with collectively, in a sense. For instance, the notion of traces for collective memory, it has been a common enterprise, and in many ways it was supported by infrastructures, material and information infrastructure, pretty stable and pretty much hierarchically organized in the past. Now, if you're thinking about the kind of, ideas that Anat was talking about, the kind of challenges that we have, for instance, with these new kinds of memory and the way that these are shaped and are happening in this new information environment, what do we do with that? I mean, what is really, for an institution such as, for a foundation such as Europeana, was looking at the cultural reality, the moment that it becomes heritage, history, culture, society, and says, okay, I'm going to be a voice for all this as it's happening to Europe in the past, but also as it's evolving in the present. What is there to be done in order to be able to allow such activity to become part of a legitimate and positive and reciprocal cultural record for the future? This is a question of digital preservation, digital curation. Is there a role there? Is there something to be done? And can this be done in a way that is decentralized? Should it be done in a centralized way? This is a question to the second sort of area that I'd like you guys to enlighten us with your ideas.
Well, Anat, your example of the Trump archive, I find is very, very good case study. Of course, we also know others, like the increased, difficulties. We have to look even at something like Me Too, right? Which is very, very confusing, to say the least. Because to hold certain, let's say, males accountable online is one thing, but if you then look at the broader picture, you suddenly get a lot of other stuff involved as well. So for me, the question that Anat is posing also is the power and the possibilities, even the aesthetics, I find, of making very precise archives. And I think there's a lot of possibilities out there to do precisely that. And, the precision of it will be an incredible strength. As soon as we, opening up and, enter that very, very blurry cloud, we get lost ourselves, but, the machines get lost, the software. But how about the general audience, right? Then it suddenly becomes very, very, and we could say, okay, we embrace complexity. That's nice. That's a good thing. We will want to archive everything, but in my experience, that's not really viable, and also maybe not very worthwhile. So that's my thesis here.
I was just going to say that I was really struck by what Natalie Harrower was talking about this morning. She was, saying if it doesn't exist, build it, break your own rules, make your own stuff, play well with others, learn from communities. Don't just try and take people's stuff in order to archive it. Really work with them. And I thought that was really interesting, and I'm also just fascinated by the work that Anat's been doing in this area, kind of reconstructing content that has been disappeared and or deleted. So it seems to me that there are lots of possibilities. It's about people and institutions, I guess, committing to it.
I guess there's a whole lot of fear dominating the question of how to define heritage institutions' role within this realm. It's frightening. It's frightening mostly because of legal concerns, but also because of ethical and privacy concerns. But if we acknowledge that there are shifting boundaries between professions, and if we acknowledge that lay people can also be considered responsible archivists, and researchers can also be taught to think about preservation and not only of access for their own selfish terms, just to do their own research and publish it and forget about it, then there are new opportunities for thinking agonistically, politically, proposing agonistic approaches to these new forms of power in ways that are not illegal. What guides me through this is our post-colonial practices of counter-archiving used by minorities or other disadvantaged groups that, in a sense, acknowledge the archive, but then build counter-archives that actually show what the archive doesn't allow you to know. And I think that kind of heritage work could be very interesting and legal and creative and perhaps involving more actors and audiences in thinking about perhaps reversing our gaze and not just thinking about, okay, how are we going to archive something that is not ours, but how can we look back at these platforms and show what they're actually doing in shaping our future digital memory? So this is one proposition.
Thank you, Anat. And I want to relay a question by Tuğçe Karataş. Thank you, Tuğçe, for the question. Participation and community building through social platforms can be helpful to engage audience for cultural heritage institutions, but the algorithms and data bias are still a challenge. Do you think we have enough digital tools to crowdsource data in terms of the curation of cultural heritage data? Any good examples of digital curation? Well, that's a very pertinent question. So who wants to take this one? Is you or not, or maybe? Or any of the others? Please. So any good tools, any good ways? I mean, this really puts us very, very much in the center of the last circle of our discussion today, which is really what are then, the priorities, what are the challenges for research that really looks at this brave new world as a source of knowledge and as a source of scholarship as well. What are the challenges and applied practical challenges? Any digital tools to crowdsource this information? What about the algorithms and data biases? I mean, these are the questions. If I may just add to this, I mean, I've been sort of starting my connective digital memory in the Borderlands project a few months ago in Lithuania. And sort of what we're looking at is really a situation in which, for instance, you want to source material from Facebook and see what are these sometimes toxic, difficult debates about the difficult past and difficult memories in the past in that part of the world. You get completely different viewpoints of reality from different accounts, right? And it's very much the design of the network. It's really designed there, as Geert, I'm sure, would agree, is the major problem. So how do we approach these questions from a point of view of digital methods then to look at that material, for instance? And that's an example. There are others as well. So any ideas, any insights?
Well, what I can say is that I think we could take inspiration from what Jenny was saying earlier, which is we need to be transparent in those methods and to take that transparency and ethical consideration to how and what is archived, who is represented in those archives from the beginning of the project, all the way to disseminating the data. And I know that like, I don't want to speak for Jenny, but because that's what you do. But that's something that really struck me in my own research as well, is just to make sure that everywhere that I have to present my data at any point, I have to be conscious that I need to tell everyone how I did it. And I don't know how this translates for practical terms. So I don't know an archive in and of themselves, how transparent they are. But going back to the presentations from this morning, there are archives, for example, the archive in Ireland that Natalie was mentioning, they're very transparent about whose data is inputted into the archive. And one note that she said is that it's the people, the data that they collect, it comes from institutions who have money to digitize objects and who have applied for grants and things like that. So that transparency, I think, can take us broader into who is funded, who isn't funded, and then therefore we get more of these layers that Anat was mentioning of who is represented and why. Maybe if we follow that money, we can have a different perspective of who is represented and who isn't.
Yeah, that's a question of representation in the archive, but I still feel that we are kind of stuck in an endless phase of deconstructing the algorithms of the powers to be, and we cannot do it, and we know that, right? We try, we honestly try, but to be honest, we're not making that much progress, except for a growing awareness that also amongst the general population that this exists. Okay, so, and also amongst politicians and Brussels and so on. Yes, that is true, but that's not real progress, and especially not if you ask, what are we going to do ourselves? there are no powerful, let's say, counter data centers, or that we have built very strong kind of algorithmic weapons to shoot at others. No, that does not exist, right? For a reason that does not exist. Not just because we are stupid, because we can't do it, or we don't have enough money. No, these are not the reasons why this is the case, right? So there is something maybe also in all this, that especially these very, very harmful tools that I consider tools, really evil tools, that they will have to be banned, that we will go through to a next phase where we will see that data centers as such, will be dismantled, because they're in their core, let's say, symbols of a kind of centralization that no one wants. That this kind of centralization of power, of money, of eventually also, in the hands of very few billionaires. We know the whole story, right? That this inevitable centralization will have to come to an end, and that we will recognize that this is not where we want to go. And then you can say, okay, let's democratize the algorithms. Let's democratize artificial intelligence. Okay, I don't see it happening. It is a good idea in essence, right? But at the moment, we're fighting a very, very different fight.
Well, thank you. That's a sober reflection, actually, Geert. And clearly, I mean, this is what we come to a point in which we're identifying a lot of, we're identifying a cause, but still we don't have the networks to fight the cause, I mean, as I understand. But the cause is there, right, from what I hear from others.
Well, the awareness is growing, yes.
Yes. So any final reflections, Anat or Jenny?
Just like to note that the notion of the archive and the notion of the algorithm are contradictory. So the archive is fixed and it's for eternity, and it's supposed to be transparent, and the algorithm is generative and dynamic and ever-changing and fleeting. So the notion of archives of algorithms are contradictory by design. And the same goes, I think, for the notion of a decentralized archive, because, and that perhaps refers to what Geert just said, that you can't really democratize algorithms perhaps in the same way that you cannot decentralize archives. Mm-hmm. Someone has to curate them. Someone has to be responsible for the ethics of care and all other archival work that comes along with that. Otherwise, there are no longer archives. Nevertheless, we can still think about the notion of decentralized infrastructures and public data and new kinds of archives. And perhaps there's some work that can be done here to think about decentralized repositories or decentralized access, sharing infrastructure across institutions and actors, not just institutions, researchers and activists. There could be interesting ways for thinking of new decentralized heritage infrastructures.
Jenny?
I kind of think that's a perfect point to end on, really. But I guess there are some attempts and discussions going on about trying to create these decentralized setups. So, R&D projects at the BBC, the Generate browser, and some of the stuff Tim Berners-Lee has been working on with Solid. But I don't know that museums or cultural heritage institutions have been involved with or connected to any of that work or involved in the discussion. And it just seems to me that it would be great if we could get in the room.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's really, we are stuck between the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the spirit here, I guess, all of us. But I think thank you all for really pointing to a direction that I find is perhaps the most meaningful, which is really to point to things that we agree on. We agree on that we need to problematize and to need to sort of work again on what it means really to, when we consider participation in issues that have to do with identity, with heritage, with identities and multiple identities, with acceptance of other identities, with agency and autonomy of people. We really need to think about, what it means, how it works. We need to problematize and critique those infrastructures, as you guys have done so fabulously during this session. And we need also to re-examine the way in which we can allow space for those multiple voices, because I will finish really by just reiterating something that Anat said, which she mentioned the agonistic dimension. I'm sure that others, certainly Geert from his critique of Habermas, would agree on that we need to go perhaps beyond just the deliberative model and imagine that all this world of digital interactions and resources that happens out there in the social networks is like this kind of deliberation. It's like deliberative conversation. It's not always a conversation. Collective subjects need also to have a voice and to need to have the autonomy and the integrity of that voice. So, and the main message, I guess, for all of us in the field of cultural heritage, digital heritage, is really to rethink along these lines on the scope of heritage, especially with all these new massive networked infrastructures that are out there, to rethink of the ways and the approaches in which it's go back and intervene, archive it perhaps, or try to make it into the kind of collective resource that can be a good thing for our societies, and in ways also that allows our societies to evolve and multiple voices to exist in a reciprocal fashion that really respects those subaltern and excluded voices. So with these words, I want to thank you all. We're just 4 minutes late. I want to thank you all. Thank our audience, first of all, for being there and for being part of this event, the whole event, but this session in particular. And also, most importantly, our speakers in this session, Geert Lovink, Maria Paula Arias, Jenny Kidd, and Anat Ben David. And finally, thank Europeana, the Europeana Foundation, for hosting and for organizing this event, and especially the people who've been very central in making it happen in practice. Alba Irolo, who's been the force of nature behind all this organization, and also Tamara Van Hulst, who's been also the power behind the wheels in making the meeting happen with our technical infrastructure. So thank you all, and I hope that it's not really a thank you and goodbye. I hope it's also an invitation to a continuation of a conversation at some future venue, and I hope to see you all again and continue this very, very important debates about our field and about society on the whole and more generally. So thank you all, and so long to the next time. Bye.